There is a silence that hangs over the ruins of antiquity, a silence that is more than just the absence of noise. It is the profound stillness of forgotten things, of voices long since quieted, of beliefs that once animated thousands of souls, now reduced to dust and broken stone. We walk upon the scattered fragments of empires, often unaware of the intricate worlds that lies beneath our feet. In the shadowy corners of the Roman world, beneath the bustling streets of its cities and the fortified outposts of its frontiers, there existed such a world. It was a place of darkness lit by flickering oil lamps, a place of secret handshakes and whispered oaths, a place dedicated to a god who came from the distant east and conquered the conquerors. His name was Mithras, and for nearly 4 centuries, his cult was one of the most powerful and enigmatic forces in the Mediterranean. Yet, today, he's a ghost. Unlike the other great faiths that rose from that fertile era, Mithras left behind no holy book, no gospels, no elegant theological treatises explaining his nature. He left only statues, altars, and the silent subterranean temples known as Mithria. To understand him, we must descend into these caves and piece together a story told not in words, but in symbols and stone. It is a detective story of the ancient world, a pursuit of a shadow that stretches back further than Rome itself, into the mists of a far older time. To begin the search for Mithras is to step into a labyrinth of scholarly debate and ancient confusion. The trail does not begin in the Italian peninsula, but thousands of miles to the east, on the high, windswept plateaus of ancient Iran and in the sacred verses of the Indian Vedas. Here, more than 1,000 years before the first Roman emperor, a deity named Mithra was already ancient. He was not the figure we would later see in the Roman caves, clad in a Phrygian cap and wrestling a bull. This older Mithra was a being of ethereal light, a guardian of cosmic order, and, most crucially, the lord of the contract. In a world without written laws or vast police forces, society was held together by the sacredness of the oath. Mithra was the divine witness to these bonds. He was the all-seeing one, the light of day that exposed falsehood. When 2 kings swore a treaty or 2 merchants made a deal, they did so under the watchful eye of Mithra. To break such an oath was not merely a social transgression. It was a cosmic crime, an affront to the fundamental order of the universe supervised by this stern and luminous god. He was a powerful, abstract principle of truth, revered by the great Achaemenid kings of Persia, who invoked his name alongside the supreme Ahura Mazda. But this god of open skies and binding words is not the god we find in the Roman underground. The connection between the Iranian Mithra and the Roman Mithras is one of history's great vanishing acts. Between the fading glory of the Persian Empire and the rise of the Roman Principate, something happened. The god changed. He was reinvented, repurposed, or perhaps entirely reimagined by a new set of worshippers for a new kind of world. The ancient Greek historian Plutarch offers one of the few tenuous links. He tells us of the Cilician pirates, formidable sea raiders who terrorized the eastern Mediterranean in the 1st century BC. These men, operating from hidden bases along the rugged coast of Asia Minor, were said to offer strange sacrifices to Mithras. It is a fleeting glimpse, suggesting a deity who had already begun to migrate from the high altars of Persia to the darker, more liminal spaces of the Hellenistic world, a god worshipped by outlaws and wanderers on the fringes of civilization. It is here, perhaps in the cultural melting pot of Anatolia, where Greek, Persian, and Roman influences collided, that the seeds of the new mysteries were sown. The transformation, however it occurred, was profound. When the cult of Mithras appears in the archaeological record of the Roman world around the end of the 1st century AD, it arrives almost fully formed, and it is radically different from its supposed Eastern ancestor. The god of the open sky has become a god of the cave. The guardian of the abstract contract has become the center of an intensely personal, salvific mystery religion. The Roman deity is young, dynamic, an action hero who engages in a singular violent act that defines his entire mythos. The static regal Mitra of Persia is gone, replaced by a figure caught in a moment of eternal struggle. This new religion was not a public faith of grand temples and open-air sacrifices. It was a private, exclusionary brotherhood. It turned away from the civic life of the Roman Forum and sought refuge in darkness. Its members called themselves Syndexio, those united by the handshake, emphasizing a personal bond both with each other and with their god. This sudden appearance has led many modern scholars to question the depth of the connection to the East. Was the Roman Mithras truly an ancient Persian deity, or was he a new creation, a piece of religious bric-a-brac assembled by Roman syncretists who merely borrowed the exotic name and some superficial trappings of an Oriental god to lend their new invention an air of ancient authority? The Romans were fascinated by the East, by its perceived wisdom and magical antiquity. A god who claimed lineage from the Magi of Zoroaster held a certain mystique that a homegrown deity could not match. Perhaps Mithraism was, as one scholar put it, the Roman version of an Oriental religion, a fantasy of the East tailored for a Western audience. The truth likely lies somewhere in the shadowy middle. The name is undeniable, as are certain Persian loanwords used within the cult's rituals. Yet, the core iconography, the astrological framework, and the structure of the grades seem thoroughly products of the Hellenistic and Roman world. What is certain is that by the early 2nd century AD, the cult had begun its slow, steady infiltration of the empire. It did not travel through missionary zeal or public preaching. It spread along the arteries of Roman power, carried by the very agents of that power: soldiers, imperial bureaucrats, merchants, and freedmen. Wherever the legions marched, wherever the administration set up an outpost, the god of the handshake soon followed. From the sun-baked garrisons of North Africa to the damp, chilly forts of Hadrian's Wall in Britain, small groups of men began to gather. They pooled their resources to buy a small plot of land or to renovate the cellar of a tavern or a villa. They would build their sanctuary, their Mithraeum, designed to mimic a natural cave. And there, in the flickering lamplight, they would install the central image of their faith, the icon that would become repeated thousands of times across 3 continents, the visual enigma that held the key to their mysteries. This image, known as the Tauroctony, is the defining masterpiece of the cult. No Mithraeum was complete without it. It is a scene of cosmic drama and intense pathos. In the center stands the youthful god Mithras, wearing his signature Persian cap and a flowing cape. He has subdued a great bull, forcing it to the ground. His left knee is planted firmly on the beast's back. His left hand pulls back its head by the nostrils, and with his right hand, he plunges a dagger deep into its shoulder. Yet, even as he performs this violent act, his face is not one of rage or triumph. He looks away, his gaze turned toward the heavens with an expression of sorrowful duty, or perhaps divine detachment. Around this central sacrifice, a strange cast of supporting characters appears with remarkable consistency. A dog and a snake drink the blood flowing from the wound. A scorpion attacks the bull's testicles. A raven perches on the god's cape. In the upper corners, the busts of the sun and the moon look on as witnesses. For the initiate entering the cave for the first time, his eyes adjusting to the gloom, this image was the beginning and end of the mystery. It was not merely a picture of a god killing an animal. It was a star map, a theological statement, and a promise of salvation all at once. Every element, from the position of the god's cape to the scorpion below, was part of a complex celestial code that the initiate would spend a lifetime deciphering. The bull was not just a beast on the field. It was a constellation, a cosmic force whose death was necessary for the renewal of life. In the silence of the cave, the stone spoke of a universe governed by rigid laws, a place where life came from death, and where the soul could find a path back to the stars, guided by the god who had mastered the cosmos through a single, reluctant sacrifice. This was the secret that drew thousands into the underground, the shadow that grew in the heart of the empire. To find Mithras in the ancient world, one had to leave the light of the Roman day behind. His temples were not the soaring marble columned edifices that dominated the city centers, dedicated to Jupiter or Apollo, open to the sky and the public gaze. The abodes of Mithras were secrets hidden in the earth. They were called speleia, caves. Sometimes they were natural grottos adapted for ritual use, but more often they were man-made subterranean chambers, deliberately constructed beneath private houses, bath complexes, or the sprawling footprint of military barracks. To enter one was a deliberate act of separation from the mundane world. The initiate descended narrow stairs, the air growing cooler and damper with every step, the sounds of the busy street above fading into a muffled hum. This descent was not merely physical. It was a psychological journey, a return to a primordial womb or perhaps a tomb. The darkness was essential. It was the canvas upon which the mysteries would be revealed, a space designed to deprive the senses of the familiar and focus the mind entirely on the ritual drama to come. The interior of a Mithraeum was small, intimate, and intensely claustrophobic. Unlike the vast basilicas of later Christianity, these spaces were not built for crowds. Most could hold no more than 20 or 30 men, packed tightly together in the gloom. The basic architectural plan was remarkably consistent across the entirety of the empire, from Syria to Britain. It was a long, narrow rectangular room with a vaulted ceiling, designed to resemble the rough, rocky interior of a natural cave. Flanking a central aisle were two raised stone benches, podia, where the initiates would recline during their communal meals and ceremonies, their shoulders touching in the cramped space. There were no windows. The only light came from flickering oil lamps placed in niches along the walls or standing on the floor, casting long, dancing shadows that made the rough stone walls seem to breathe and move. The air would have been thick with the smell of burning oil, incense, and the sweat of close-quartered men. At the far end of this aisle, often set within an arched recess or apse that symbolized the boundary of the known cosmos, stood the altar and the inevitable, dominating focal point of the entire religion, the tauroctony. We return to the image we encountered at the end of the last chapter, for it is here, in the context of the sacred cave, that its true power is revealed. The tauroctony was not a static decoration. It was the central engine of the Mithraic theology. In the trembling lamplight at the end of the long aisle, the scene of the gods slaying the bull became an urgent, dynamic reality. We must look closer now, past the central drama of the knife and the beast, to the details that surround them, for this was not a terrestrial scene. The cave of the Mithraeum represented the cosmos itself. The vaulted ceiling above the initiates' heads was often painted vivid blue and studded with golden stars, sometimes featuring hidden holes through which lamps could shine, mimicking the constellations of the night sky. The act of sacrifice depicted at the altar was taking place not in a field on earth, but in the heavens. Almost every element in the standard tauroctony sculpture corresponds to a celestial body known to ancient astronomy. The bull is not merely an animal, but the zodiac constellation Taurus. The scorpion attacking its genitals is Scorpio. The dog drinking the blood is Canis Major. The snake alongside it is the constellation Hydra. The raven perching on the god's cape is Corvus. Even the figures of the two torchbearers, Cautes and Cautopates, who stand on either side of the scene, one holding his torch up, signifying sunrise and spring, the other pointing his torch down, signifying sunset and autumn, represent the equinoxes, the pivotal turning points of the solar journey. The entire sculpture is a star map, a frozen moment of celestial alignment. The initiate in the cave was not just looking at a picture. He was staring into the intricate clockwork of the universe. Why was this astronomical obsession central to a mystery religion? The ancient Greco-Roman world was haunted by the concept of fate, the crushing belief that human destiny was rigidly controlled by the movements of the stars and planets, the Hymarmene. The 7 planets known at the time were seen not just as physical bodies, but as powerful, sometimes tyrannical gatekeepers, archons that trapped the soul in the material world and dictated its fortunes. The grand claim of the Mithraic mysteries, whispered in the darkness of the cave, was that their god was superior to these cosmic powers. The Tauroctony is a depiction of a cosmic revolution. By slaying the bull, the premier symbol of vitality and earthy power, but also a fixed astrological marker, Mithras was demonstrating his ability to shift the very axis of the universe. He was not subject to the stars. He was their ruler, often depicted in other iconography, turning the zodiac wheel itself. He could stop the turning of the heavens and open a path for the soul to escape the relentless cycle of fate set by the planets. The pained, averted look on his face as he slays the bull suggests this is a necessary burden, a divine intervention required to release the life force locked within the material world, symbolized by the grain that sometimes sprouts from the bull's dying tail, and the blood consumed by the dog and snake, fertilizing the earth. The Mithraeum was therefore a profound paradox, a dark, subterranean hole in the ground designed to reveal the highest light of heaven. For the men huddled on those stone benches, the outside world of Roman politics, border wars, and rigid social hierarchies temporarily ceased to exist. They were no longer just soldiers or merchants. They were initiates in a cosmic drama. The cave was a womb where they could be reborn, freed from the constraints of their earthly station. Whether they were a high-ranking centurion or a lowly slave, inside the cave, they were brothers of the handshake, united in the secret knowledge that the universe was not a chaotic void, but a meticulously ordered mechanism. And crucially, they knew the pilot of that mechanism. The image glowing at the end of the room was an assurance that the terrifying powers governing life and death could be navigated, and that death was not the end, but merely a gate to the stars, unlocked by the dagger of Mithras. If you trace the archaeological map of the Mithraic cult, a distinct and telling pattern emerges. The temples do not cluster in the soft, olive-growing heartlands of Italy or the intellectual centers of Greece. Instead, they hug the dangerous edges. They follow the great rivers, the Rhine and the Danube, and they cling to the stone walls that mark the absolute limits of civilization. Mithraism was, above all else, the religion of the frontier. To understand its explosive growth in the 2nd and 3rd centuries, we must leave the darkness of the theological cave and stand on the ramparts of a Roman fort, looking out into the barbarian mist. For the men stationed here on the damp moors of northern Britain, in the dark forests of Germania, or along the sun-scorched banks of the Euphrates, life was a grinding oscillation between boredom and sheer terror. These were the limes, the militarized borders where the empire held back the chaos of the world. A Roman legionary stationed here was often thousands of miles from the home of his birth. He was isolated, subject to harsh discipline, and constantly aware of his own mortality. In this brutal masculine environment, the soft, civic cults of the traditional Roman pantheon offered little comfort. Jupiter was too distant. Venus was too frivolous. The soldier needed a god who understood the mud, the blood, and the necessity of hard orders. He found that god in Mithras. The affinity between the Roman army and the cult of Mithras was so strong that some historians have called it the religion of the camp. It is no coincidence that the spread of the mysteries perfectly mirrors the movements of the legions. When the Legio 15 Apollinaris moved from the east to the Danube, Mithraic temples sprang up in their wake like sparks from a marching torch. This was a faith that spoke the soldier's language. Mithras was often invoked with the title Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. He was a victor, a warrior who had struggled and triumphed. But unlike the chaotic war gods of the barbarians, Mithras was a god of order, hierarchy, and discipline. The central act of the Tauroctony, the slaying of the bull, was not a frenzy of bloodlust. As we have seen, it was a stoic act of duty. Mithras killed because he had to, because the order of the cosmos demanded it. This resonated deeply with the professional soldier, whose life was defined not by personal desire, but by the rigid execution of orders that often required violence. In the face of Mithras, the legionary saw a divine reflection of his own burden, the heavy, solemn duty to maintain order against the forces of chaos. Furthermore, the structural reality of the cult provided a vital psychological anchor for men living on the edge. The Roman army was a machine of strict stratification. A gulf of class and command separated the common infantryman from the aristocratic legate. But in the subterranean twilight of the Mithraeum, those rigid barriers softened. The cult was organized into 7 grades of initiation, a hierarchy based on spiritual progress rather than worldly rank. It was not unknown for a high-ranking centurion to be of a lower Mithraic grade than one of his own subordinates. Inside the cave, they were brothers, fratres, bound by secret oaths and shared meals. This created a powerful, cohesive micro-society, a band of brothers that offered a sense of belonging and safety that the vast impersonal machinery of the empire could not. The cult provided a surrogate family for men forbidden to marry during their service. The small size of the temples, holding only 20 or 30 men, fostered intense camaraderie. Trust was the currency of the frontier. You had to know that the man holding the shield next to you would not break the line. The Mithraic oath, the sacramentum, reinforced this earthly loyalty with a divine one. To betray a brother in the cult was to betray the god of contracts himself. Thus, the Mithraea found in the ruins of military forts, like those at Karabog on Hadrian's Wall or at Dura Europos in Syria, were more than just chapels. They were social clubs, lodges, and sanctuaries where the terror of the upcoming campaign could be mitigated by the reassuring grip of a brother's hand and the promise of a god who could not be conquered. For the soldier facing death, Mithraism offered the ultimate fortification, a guarantee of the soul's survival. The army promised a pension and a plot of land after 25 years of service, a reward many would never live to see. Mithras promised something far more durable. The mysteries taught that the soul was immortal, a spark of light trapped in matter, and that through the grades of the cult, one learned the passwords to navigate the planetary spheres after death. This was a potent morale booster. A soldier who believes his spirit is invincible is a soldier who fights with terrifying calm. As the 3rd century dawned and the borders of Rome began to buckle under the weight of invasions, plague, and civil war, the legions turned increasingly to the savior from the east. They needed a god who was not just a statue in a distant city, but a comrade who stood with them in the shield wall, a deus invictus who guaranteed that even if the body fell in the mud of a foreign land, the victory of the spirit was assured. To enter the Mithraeum was merely the first step. To truly belong to Mithras, one had to climb. The architecture of the cult was not horizontal, spreading out to embrace the masses, but vertical, a steep and arduous ascent toward the divine. The mysteries were structured around a hierarchy of 7 distinct grades, a holy ladder that the initiate spent his entire life scaling. This was not an arbitrary administrative structure. It was a precise mapping of the cosmos onto the human soul. The ancients believed the Earth was surrounded by 7 planetary spheres: Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, Saturn, the Moon, and the Sun. As the soul descended from the heavens to be born in a body, it passed through these spheres, acquiring the heavy, corrupting traits of each planet: greed from one, anger from another, lust from a third. The goal of the Mithraic initiation was to reverse this fall. By ascending the 7 grades, the initiate was symbolically traveling back up through the planetary gates, shedding those earthly impurities one by one, lightening the soul until it was pure enough to stand before the unconquered light. The journey began at the bottom with the grade of Corax, the Raven. The Raven was the servant, the messenger, linked to the swift planet Mercury. In the ritual meals that bound the community together, the ravens waited on the higher members, wearing bird masks or imitating the croaking call of the bird. It was a chaotic, noisy, liminal state, the beginning of wisdom, but far from mastery. From there, one ascended to Nymphos, the male bride, a strange and mystical grade associated with Venus and the element of water, symbolizing a soul betrothed to the god, hidden in a veil, waiting for illumination. But it was the third grade that marked the true crossing of the threshold, the point of no return for the serious devotee. This was the grade of Miles, the soldier. The transition to the grade of Miles was marked by a ritual of profound psychological power, a terror mystery designed to test the initiate's resolve. We know from Christian critics like Tertullian, who wrote about these rites with a mixture of revulsion and grudging respect, that the initiate was often subjected to physical ordeals, heat, cold, fasting, and mock executions. In the central rite of the soldier, the initiate was brought forward, likely blindfolded and kneeling. A crown was placed upon his head, a symbol of worldly power and victory. In a scripted moment of defiance, the initiate was required to reach up, snatch the crown from his head, and cast it to the floor, declaring, "Mithras is my only crown." From that day forward, the Miles would never wear a garland or a wreath at a banquet or a military triumph. He had marked himself as separate, a soldier of a higher army. He was now under the protection of Mars, the planet of war. He had rejected the soft rewards of the earth for the hard steel of the spirit. Those who persevered passed into the higher priestly grades. They became the Leo, the lion, the fierce guardians of the fire, who washed their hands not with water but with honey, symbolizing their purity and preservation. They ascended to Perses, the Persian, claiming the ancient lineage of the cult's founders. They became Heliodromus, the Sunrunner, the grade that mirrored the sun god himself, sitting at the right hand of the Father during the sacred feasts. Finally, at the very pinnacle of the hierarchy stood the Potter, the Father. The Potter was the supreme authority of the Mithraeum, the earthly representative of Mithras himself. He was the shepherd of the small flock, the keeper of the secret handshakes and the ancient passwords. In the iconography, he is often depicted wearing the Phrygian cap of the god, seated in the place of honor, holding a staff and a libation bowl. He had completed the journey. He had passed through the 7 gates, mastered the 7 planetary forces, and arrived at the realm of Saturn, the highest and most distant sphere. To look upon the Father in the dim light of the cave was to see a man who had, in a spiritual sense, already died and been reborn. He was a living bridge between the damp, dark earth and the eternal stars. This rigid, demanding hierarchy was the steel spine of the cult. It gave every man a place, a goal, and a sense of progress. In a chaotic world where fortunes could rise and fall on the whim of a mad emperor, the Mithraic ladder offered a stable path to glory, a way to climb out of the mud and touch the face of God, one secret step at a time. By the middle of the 3rd century, the Rumang Empire was dying. It was an age of iron and rust, defined by a 50-year period of anarchy where emperors rose and fell with the seasons, murdered by their own guards or slain on forgotten battlefields. The borders were bleeding, the economy had collapsed, and the old gods of Rome, Jupiter, Juno, Mars seemed silent, unable to halt the slide into chaos. In this vacuum of power and hope, the eyes of the state turned toward the sun. The Emperor Aurelian, a hardened soldier emperor who miraculously stitched the fragmented empire back together, did not thank Jupiter for his victories. He thanked Sol Invictus, the unconquered sun. He established a state cult to the supreme solar deity, a monotheistic vision meant to unify a fractured world under one god and one emperor. And in the slipstream of this solar revolution, Mithras ascended to his greatest height. He was no longer just a secret whispered in the dark by border guards. He was now recognized as a potent aspect of the supreme sun, the Fotori Imperi, the patron of the empire. At the very end of the century, in 308 AD, the most powerful men in the world, the retired Emperor Diocletian and his co-emperors, gathered at the military camp of Carnuntum on the Danube. There, in a moment of supreme political theater, they dedicated an altar not to the traditional pantheon, but to Mithras, declaring him the protector of their empire. It seemed for a brief, shimmering moment that the West was on the verge of becoming a Mithraic state. The god of the handshake had moved from the cellar to the imperial palace. But as Mithras stood on the precipice of total victory, he looked across the spiritual landscape and saw a rival. Another Eastern mystery had arrived in Rome, another faith that spoke of a savior, of light, and of eternal life. But this one did not hide in caves. It was growing in the tenements of the cities, among the women, the slaves, and the forgotten masses. It was the sect of the Nazarene. The conflict between Mithraism and Christianity is often framed as a war between opposites. But to a Roman citizen in the 3rd century, they would have looked bewilderingly similar. In fact, the early church fathers were terrified by the resemblance. They watched with horror as the Mithras celebrated the birth of their god on December 25th, the Natalis Invicti, the birthday of the unconquered sun. They saw the initiates of Mithras partaking in a communal meal of bread and wine, using words that sounded suspiciously like a Eucharist. They saw a religion that promised the resurrection of the body and the salvation of the soul through a baptism of blood. The similarities were so striking that Christian apologists like Justin Martyr and Tertullian did not deny them. Instead, they claimed that the devil, who could foresee the coming of Christ, had created Mithraism centuries in advance as a diabolical mockery, a trap designed to confuse the faithful by imitating the true sacraments before they even existed. For decades, the two faiths ran on parallel tracks, often literally side by side. In the ruins of Rome and Ostia, we find Mithraea and Christian house churches separated by mere alleyways. They were the two great competitors for the soul of the late empire. Both offered a personal relationship with the divine that the cold civic rituals of paganism could never match. Both provided a structure of morality and a promise that death was not the end. But beneath the surface, there was a fatal asymmetry. Mithraism, for all its imperial backing and military strength, was fundamentally handicapped by its own design. It was an exclusive club. It admitted only men. It required money to pay for the feasts and the temple upkeep. It demanded a complex intellectual engagement with astronomy and philosophy. It was a religion of the elite, the strong, and the chosen few. Christianity, by contrast, was radically, dangerously inclusive. It opened its doors to women, who made up half the population and raised the next generation of believers. It welcomed the slave, the cripple, and the destitute, telling them they were equal to kings in the eyes of God. It did not require a secret initiation in a dark cave. It demanded public testimony in the light of day. While the Mithraic potter was carefully selecting his next recruit from the officer class, the Christian bishop was baptizing entire families in the river. Mithraism was a fortress, strong but static. Christianity was a flood. As the 3rd century bled into the 4th, the demographic tide began to turn. The soldier's god held the frontiers, but the carpenter's son was winning the cities. The final confrontation was inevitable. The empire was not big enough for two sons. The end of the cult of Mithras did not come with a whimper, nor did it simply fade away into the mists of irrelevance. It was murdered. The death blow was struck not on the frontiers where the god was strongest, but in the heart of the political machine. In 312 AD, the Emperor Constantine looked up at the sun before a pivotal battle and saw not the face of Sol Invictus or Mithras, but a cross of light. His subsequent victory at the Mulvian Bridge changed the trajectory of human history. For the first time, the immense machinery of the Roman state began to turn against the old gods. Initially, it was a slow strangulation. Constantine did not ban Mithraism, but he withdrew the oxygen that kept it alive: imperial patronage. The ambitious generals and bureaucrats, sensing the shifting winds, quietly stopped funding the banquets and maintaining the temples. The flow of silver dried up. The ladder of promotion now led to the steps of the Christian basilica, not the subterranean cave. For a religion that relied so heavily on the support of the military and the elite, this loss of status was a catastrophic wound. Yet, the cult lingered. In the shadows of the 4th century, there were final, desperate attempts to hold back the tide. A brief resurgence occurred under Julian the Apostate, the last pagan emperor, who initiated himself into the mysteries and tried to rally the old faiths against the Galilean madness. But Julian died on a Persian spear after a rule of only 2 years, and with him died the last hope of the pagan world. What followed was a campaign of systematic erasure. The Emperor Theodosius I issued a series of decrees in the late 4th century that made all pagan sacrifice illegal. The eternal fire of Vesta was extinguished, the Olympics were halted, and the private, secret meetings of the Mithraists were declared acts of treason. The caves, once sanctuaries of order, were now branded dens of demons. The state had declared war on its own past, and the soldiers of Christ were ready to execute the sentence. The archaeological record of this period reads like a crime scene. Across the empire, from the Rhine to the sands of Egypt, we find Mithraea that were not merely abandoned, but violently destroyed. This was not the work of barbarians, but of Christian mobs, often led by local bishops. The violence was symbolic and precise. They did not just smash the altars, they desecrated them. In the Mithraeum of Gninigshon, the great relief of the Tauroctony was shattered into hundreds of pieces, the face of the god obliterated with hammers. In other temples, the Christians engaged in ritual humiliation of the rival deity. They used the sacred caves as garbage dumps, filling them with rubble and refuse. In a particularly chilling example at Saarbrücken, the skeletons of criminals were thrown into the sanctuary, a deliberate act of spiritual pollution designed to render the space forever unclean to the Mithraic faithful. The ultimate victory, however, was architectural. In a display of dominance that is still visible today, the church literally crushed the cult. In Rome, the 12th century Basilica of San Clemente sits upon a 4th century church, which in turn sits directly atop a 2nd century Mithraeum. To descend into the crypts of San Clemente is to physically travel down through the Strait of Conquest. The high altar of the Christian god rests squarely on the ceiling of the Mithraic cave, pressing it down into the earth. It was a statement written in stone. We are the new masters. Your God is beneath our feet. The unconquered sun had been conquered. The light of the world had been replaced by a new light. The caves were sealed, the entrances paved over, and the name of Mithras was erased from the public consciousness. And then there was silence. A silence that lasted for 1,000 years. Because the cult of Mithras was a mystery religion, reliant on oral tradition and secret oaths, it left no written defense. There were no Mithraic martyrs writing letters from prison, no gospels hidden in jars to be found centuries later. When the last potter died and the last cave was filled with rubble, the theology of Mithras vanished. We do not know their prayers. We do not know the hymns they sang. We can only guess at the true meaning of their star maps. The religion that once commanded the loyalty of the masters of the world was reduced to a puzzle of broken statues and silent iconography. Today, Mithras is a ghost of the museum, a footnote in the history of the church. But standing in the cool, damp air of an excavated Mithraeum, one can almost feel the residual heat of the lamps that once burned there. We are reminded of the fragility of belief. We see how easily a universal truth can be dismantled, how a God who promised eternity can be buried by time. The cult of Mithras serves as a solemn monument to the things we have lost, a reminder that history is written by the victors, and that in the darkness of the past, there are stories that will never be told, secrets that the earth will keep forever. The handshake is broken. The cave is empty, and the sun has moved on.